This Hollywood Reporter and Billboard Pride Summit conversation is brought to you by Apple TV Plus.
Hey there, everyone. I'm Travell Anderson, entertainment journalist and co host of the podcast Fan Tide. Thank you all so much for joining us for this wonderful conversation that we have here with Wilson Cruz, Ryan White.
Prom.
Live up to
Or kind of
the stories, those shows.
Enough attention. We
Work in television from Gilligan's Island, where they would both brought this up. How
This Hollywood Reporter and Billboard Pride Summit conversation is brought to you by Apple TV Plus.
Hey there, everyone. I'm Travell Anderson, entertainment journalist and co host of the podcast Fan Tide. Thank you all so much for joining us for this wonderful conversation that we have here with Wilson Cruz, Ryan White, and Jess Hargrave from Apple TV Plus's Visible out on television. Now, I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. We're going to start with Wilson.
Hi, I'm Wilson Cruz, and I'm an executive producer on Visible out on television.
That's all you're going to say, Wilson?
Well, I thought we were just introducing ourselves.
You are? I mean, you're more than just an executive producer on Visible.
I'm also an actor for the last 25 years, and a producer and an activist and a loving human being who's happy to be alive during this moment in time.
Amen. Wonderful
How's that?
intro. We'll go to you next, Ryan.
I'm Ryan White, and I am the director of Visible, and just that.
And last but not least.
Hi, I'm Jessica Hargrave, and I'm the producer of Visible out on television.
Wonderful. Thank you both, all three of you, for joining us. So I guess I'm going to start with you, Wilson. We're having this conversation. Pride is happening as a lot of these, the social uprising and social unrest is happening in the streets all at the same time. I know that, a lot of people have had kind of conflicted feelings just about celebrating Pride in this particular moment. So I want to start with acknowledging what's happening right now. And just give you an opportunity to talk about your personal feelings and how you come to this moment of pride as we see, the developments happening in the streets.
Yeah, I think this moment, given everything that we're experiencing globally, really, not just here in the States, but in terms of the virus and in terms of this uprising, I think what it means to me is that it gives us as an opportunity as a community to live up to the expectation of community, which is that we stand up for each other, that we take care of each other. It was really moving to me during the sheltering at home early on that I saw within our community a real effort to extend ourselves out to members of our community, and that there was a real sense of responsibility when prides were canceled across the country. What I was really proud of was that people were like, yes, this is something that we have to do for the good of all of us. And then during this uprising, it's really moving to me to see this community take this opportunity to look at ourselves. How can we be a part of the change in this moment? How can we finally, within our own community, acknowledge that we have some work to do within our own community about how we navigate race, how we really question our own biases, and how we truly take care of each other through this moment. You know, African American, Black and brown people, people of color have been trying to have this conversation about race in our community for decades. And I feel like this is truly an opportunity, and I think we're taking it to have that conversation. So as far as I'm concerned, this is an opportunity, and I am proud of the fact that we're taking the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think this is a really great moment and really a segue into this conversation about Visible out on television, because what you all put together is this diverse representation of the LGBTQ community, talking about the ways in which kind of life has changed in terms of how we're represented, both kind of off screen, but also in front of the screen as well. Ryan, could you talk a little bit about your kind of ideation around putting this film together in the first place?
Sure. Well, Visible has been in the works for over a decade at this point, and it far predates me. So Wilson and two producers named David Bender and David Permit have been stomping the pavement for years trying to get this documentary off the ground. And a couple years ago, they brought the idea to Apple TV Plus before it had launched as a streaming platform. And Apple loved the idea, and they brought it to me to direct. And if I'm being completely honest, when I was first asked to do it, I said no, because documentaries take years, you know, so I'm only usually making 2 or 3 at a time. And my real interest in documentary filmmaking has always been following something that's unfolding, usually a person or a group of people, like following on history in the making, something that's happening in front of the camera. And on first impression, I kind of saw this as a historical documentary, which isn't what I normally do. But as I started to cut my teeth and dive into the research, and especially, you know, I'm born in 1981, the decades that predate me that existed on television history, and learn from queer people of older generations what it was like to watch television while they were growing up, I realized that there was a lot of really rich storytelling to be done within this story. So I said to Apple, like, look, if you're willing to do this, not as a clip show, that's just like a series of firsts from queer television history, but you're really willing to give us the real estate, which it ended up being a 5-part series instead of a feature film, the real estate to tell these stories in depth with beginning, middle, and ends, then maybe I'm the right director. And Apple said that's exactly what we're looking for. So we're so thankful that they gave us that amount of time to dedicate to this story, because it's a 70-year story, and adding to that right now. And still, even having done it in 5 episodes, I get tweets all the time of all the things I left out. But it at least allowed us to include as much breadth as possible in the series.
Now, Jess, could you talk to us a little bit about your role with the film and what you brought to the team?
Sure. Ryan and I are partners in a production company. We've worked together on all of his films. And so on this film specifically, when they came to Ryan and talked to him about it, he came to me and we discussed what we thought it could be, and really saw it as an opportunity to do what he's describing, which is to make it into a lot of little documentary films. We really wanted to stay true to our storytelling style, but also that's just what we do. And we knew that that would also be the most powerful way that we could convey the message of this project. Instead of just showing a bunch of clips and having light little commentary on it, we wanted to really dive into it. And so my job was to partner with him creatively, but also to oversee our team, which was a team that we set out from the beginning to be sure was very diverse in all spectrum that we could. Like, we had people who were decades apart in age. We had people from all over. We had to be sure that we had as much diversity as possible, because we wanted to be sure that in all of those meetings, which we had so many meetings with Wilson, with our other EP, Wanda Sykes, and with our team of editors and everyone, saying, like, we want to hear from everyone. We want to hear from everyone how you feel about this, what this makes you feel, what you think should be important, what you think is important that we include, because we really had to whittle it down, and we couldn't include everything. But that was part of my job, was to make sure that we included as many voices as we could.
And I have to say, you know, as EP of this project, that in terms of having those conversations, of making sure that we were having, that we had diverse voices and input. There was never a question about that being our priority on any level. Every person involved in this project knew that that had to be of utmost importance. And I'm personally, it's one of the things I'm most proud of.
Yeah, and you've been, I feel like, having this conversation about the importance of representation and the importance of kind of telling, I think, LGBTQ stories. Could you talk to me a little bit about why you feel like this moment in particular is the right one for visible and for people to be learning about kind of this history and this trajectory of LGBTQ imagery?
Yeah, I think I think there have we have been ripe for this conversation for 20 years, right? I'm glad that it's happening now, but I've been working on this for 7 years, and even before I started working on it, David Bender had been working on it for maybe 10 years before that. So he really knew that this was a conversation we needed to have. He brought me on to help him get it done. But for me, the purpose of it, the reason why it's important is that, if I may steal a quote from my hero and icon, Martin Luther King, he said, justice doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through continuous struggle. And we have to continue to have this conversation about diversity, about visibility in our community. And if we don't continue to have that conversation, we don't force the conversation, insist on it, then we won't have it at all. And an example of that is just how long it took us to get this on the air. But given the advances we've made in the conversation about diversity in the last few years, made it possible for us to get this on the air. For me, it was really an opportunity to say thank you and to bring attention to the many people, LGBTQ and allies, who really risked so much in order to tell these stories, especially early on in the movement. I wanted to say thank you to those people who really worked to make me visible, to allow me to have the kind of visibility and out loud life that I lead. And when I think about the sacrifices and risks that people took in order to tell these stories, it's incredibly moving to me. And on top of that, I feel like because our schools don't teach our history, that it was incredibly important for young people to understand how we got to this moment where you can turn on your television and LGBTQ people are ubiquitous. And that didn't just happen, that happened through continuous struggle. And it was high time that we took the moment to say thank you. And that's what this series is about. And I can't tell you how many young people have reached out to me just to say, I had no idea. Not even just young people, people from the spectrum of age have said, I didn't know that until I watched this. And so it's a real argument for teaching our history. How can we learn from it if we don't learn from it, or learn about it?
Yeah. To your point, Wilson, and this is for you, Ryan, I feel like, putting documentaries together on any type of community's history is like a big undertaking, because, there are some of the things that everybody knows about, but you also want it to be kind of fresh and new in terms of the education that's happening. I'm wondering if there's a particular story or particular happening in terms of LGBTQ representation that you knew had to be involved in this story, whether people knew a lot about it before or not.
Well, I mean, there's so many stories in the documentary that I could go on and on, but I think a great example to your question would be, like if you look at television in the late 90s, early 2000s, everybody at least remembers the story of Ellen DeGeneres coming out. everybody remembers Will and Grace, of course, but how do you go back and look at those shows through like a modern day lens? So a great example of that, I think, in our series is a show that Wilson was on called Noah's Ark, created by Patrick Ian Polk. And we have a scene earlier in the series, which we kind of jokingly referred to as the lesbian montage. It's Wanda Sykes, Ellen DeGeneres, and Margaret Cho talking all about how there were no lesbians on television when they were growing up. So all of these characters on television that they would kind of make into lesbians, you know, Alice from the Brady Bunch or Marianne from Gilligan's Island, where they would insert these narratives onto these female characters to see themselves in them. And later, when we're looking at Noah's Ark, you know, which is mainly a series about Black gay men and Latino gay men, I was so surprised interviewing Wanda Sykes and Lena Waithe, both brought this up, how much they loved that show. And it wasn't because they necessarily saw themselves as Black lesbians represented. It was because there were no Black lesbians on television for them. So to see anybody that looked like them on television was huge for them. And they would tune in every week. And Lena Waithe actually says there would be no Thanksgiving episode, which is her amazing episode of Master of None, without a Noah's Ark. It inspired her so much. So how do you know, Noah's Ark surely didn't have near the ratings that Will and Grace did, but it was so formative for so many legends that work in television today. So how do you balance those types of stories? And so that was really fun for us, I think, is to go back and look at maybe shows or characters that didn't dominate the airwaves or the headlines when they were out, and go back and look at the importance that they had in television history.
I love that you brought up Noah's
I have
Ark.
one-
Patrick Ian Polk deserves everything. Go ahead, Jess.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to add one, but I agree about Patrick Ian. He's amazing. I was going to add too that one thing that we learned more about and didn't know very much about at the beginning were some of the activists who inserted themselves onto TV. They would do these protests that were called zaps and essentially put themselves in front of the camera for that 4 seconds that they got to reach the millions of people who were, for example, watching Walter Cronkite on the news at night. And I think that story hasn't gotten enough attention. We really had to dive into that and learn more about the impact that they're called zaps, what those zaps had. And some of them truly were resulting in not only conversation in people's homes, but in more content being on the television. Like there was a group of lesbian activists who protested a show that had a very terrible depiction of lesbian women. And so they protested that. And because of that, in those conversations, they talked about a show, or they talked about a story that they had read, a true story that ended up becoming a TV movie called The Question of Love. And so a lot of people don't know that. And that was something that, even though that's not TV stars or, people that are necessarily people you're used to seeing on your screen, we wanted to give those people time to share their stories as well. Those activists are very important.
And it's actually a really good point to bring up right now, because, when those zaps happened, a lot of people, even within the LGBTQ community at the time, were wondering how that would be helpful. These acts of disobedience, right? And we see that conversation happening now. But the reason why it was helpful is because it forced people to look at the issue and to talk about it. It forced them to have a conversation, to see it, to not ignore it. They couldn't close their eyes to it. Even Walter Cronkite couldn't do that. So there's a purpose for civil disobedience. It has a real effect on the conversation.
Wilson, I feel like you're one of those people who, a lot of folks credit for representation, for being that kind of possibility model for them in media. I'm wondering for you, however, who was that person or that character that was, a representation for you?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a lot, and I have to be honest with you. In terms of seeing myself on TV, I really didn't have that. I turned to film. Really, I saw myself in people who were in the documentary Paris is Burning. I think that was really close to me in terms of film. But on television, I didn't get to see that. But I did get to be that for someone else. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of. But I think that the fact that I felt invisible is what allowed me to fill the void, right? I couldn't walk away. I couldn't ignore the fact that I felt invisible growing up. And so when the opportunity showed up for me to step up and be that for another generation, um, as scary as that was, I understood and knew that it was absolutely necessary.
Mhm. In a lot of the press materials and a lot of the interviews that I've seen you all do, a lot of you talk about this being kind of a love letter to the folks who kind of paved the way in terms of representation of the community. Particularly, you know, when a lot of younger people, they might be looking at television now and see themselves in a variety of different ways on a variety of different shows. It didn't used to be that way. But Ryan, I'm wondering for you, you know, what do you hope audiences are taking away from the stories that you all tell in Visible?
Well, I do think in many ways it is a love letter to many heroes from television like Wilson and so many before and after him, but we didn't ever want it to be only a love letter. In fact, we wanted it to be a call to action in a lot of ways, to not celebrate television and pat television on the back and say you've reached the finish line, but to say there is a lot more work to be done. And what you constantly see throughout the history of television, like I had no idea because I'm a child of the 80s. I had no idea how much progress there was in representation in the 1970s on television, especially in the late 1970s. Like Jess was mentioning earlier, that TV movie, A Question of Love, was 1978. You were seeing an incredible amount of progress. And of course, that was all torn down in the early 80s during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And so I hope the series is a reminder that no matter how much progress we make, that can always be torn away. And we still aren't there yet. I mean, there is still a dearth of representation for so many people within our LGBTQ community. And we're seeing milestones, of course, like Pose or like Ryan O'Connell on Special or like Vida. We are seeing milestones, but these are kind of popping up as one-offs. And so we kind of see Visible as a love letter, sure, but also as like a call to arms to continue pushing the boundaries of representation, both in front of and behind the camera.
And for you, Jess, I'm wondering to that end, this idea of the show of the series being a call to action. Is there something that you think like everyday people, maybe they're not in the industry, things that they can do to be part of this effort for more kind of diverse images and diverse storytelling?
It's a good question. I think it's not specific to this industry to show respect and have inclusion, certainly. So I think there's something that all of us can do. We as a community, we as a culture, but it's easy to say those things. It's we as individuals need to be doing, to listen to stories, to foster involvement, to raise people up and help with their platforms as well. I was thinking, to be honest, I was thinking about when I was 17, a very close friend of ours who was a member of the LGBTQ community committed suicide when she was like a sister to me. And I was thinking about her. Ryan and I made a documentary a few years ago called The Case Against 8, which was about same-sex marriage. And when we were making that film, and when everything was going on about same-sex marriage, I started thinking, I started thinking, oh, I wish that Liz had lived long enough to see this. And then when we were making this show, I thought the same thing. I thought, oh my gosh, it's hard for me to imagine what she was seeing on TV at the time. And I wish that she could see what we're seeing now. And I'm embarrassed to admit how long it took me to change my thinking. And part of what helped me to do that was actually our fellow executive producer, Wanda Sykes. She has a really amazingly powerful raw video on her Instagram in which she says, I'm not marching, you march. And what I realized is I should change my thinking. I should not have been saying, I wish that Liz had lived long enough to see this. I wish that we had done something sooner. And that's really how I'm trying to change my thinking. And I hope that others can too.
I love that. Thank you for that. Wilson, I'm going to give you the last word. As I mentioned, I think I know you are a lot of people's possibility models for the work that you have done and you continue to do in the industry. I'm wondering what words of wisdom or advice that you might have for, the younger next generations of LGBTQ actors who are interested in being that possibility model themselves. What would you say to them?
That's a big question, Travell. Um, I would say, if I could paraphrase, that your crown has been paid for, and all you have to do is put it on your head and wear it. Generation after generation has struggled and fought and pleaded and bled and died for the right that you now have to be fully seen. And what that means is that when you take on a project, whether you're an actor or content creator, that you can walk into those rooms without having to apologize for any part of yourself. That if you are a person who lives at an intersection of identities, you're a person of color and an LGBTQ person, that you can live those two identities and not have to apologize to either of those communities for the other things that you are. That the fact that you are all of those things makes you special. And we want to see you and we want to hear your voice because it's necessary for us to progress. And so my wish is just to see more of you, to see more of the lives that you're leading and how you can educate us and expand our idea, our concept of what an LGBTQ person's life is. And that only happens if you raise your voice. And we have paid for that crown on your head. So put it on, wear it, and tell your story.
I love that. So Visible out on television is available for streaming on Apple TV Plus. Jess, Ryan, Wilson, thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, Travell.
Thank you, Travell.
Thank you, Trevor.